It began with a silence that spread across Europe long before the explosions of war. People did not yet know that millions of civilians would soon be pulled from their homes, stuffed into trains, and forced to work like machines for a regime that believed they were born to serve. But the signs were already there, hidden inside speeches, policies, and an ideology that divided humanity like a cruel blueprint. As Hitler rose to power in 1933, Germany was a nation hungry for direction, angry at the world, and desperate for revival. The Nazis promised strength, pride, and unity. What they delivered was a system that turned ordinary people from conquered nations into slaves for the German war industry. The roots of forced labor began not with chains but with words. Nazi ideology declared that Germans were the master race and that Slavic populations, Poles, Russians, Ukrainians, were subhumans destined to serve. Jews, Roma, and other minorities were considered even further below. These beliefs were not whispered, they were shouted from podiums, printed in textbooks, drilled into soldiers, and inserted into every corner of public life. By the time Germany began preparing for war, the mindset was fully formed: some humans were to rule, and others were to work until they collapsed. After the Nazis took control, Germany launched massive rearmament projects: highways, factories, aircraft plants, ammunition production. But there was a problem: they needed workers. The Great Depression had already strained the workforce, and the scale of Hitler's military ambitions far exceeded what Germany's population could supply. Early attempts to use political prisoners and marginalized groups for labor helped fill the gap, but it was not enough. The Nazis needed millions, and they knew exactly where they would find them: in the countries they planned to conquer. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939 and World War II officially ignited, the machinery of forced labor roared to life. The occupation of Poland was not merely military, it was transformational. Within months, German authorities began rounding up civilians, often targeting young men and women. Armed soldiers stormed villages, blocked roads, and ripped people from streets and shops. Posters ordered citizens to report for work duties, and those who refused were beaten, imprisoned, or shot. Trains, sometimes cattle wagons, sometimes packed passenger cars, carried deported Poles into Germany, where they were divided and sent to farms, factories, railways, and construction projects. For many, it was a one-way journey. As the German war machine expanded across Europe in 1940 into France, Belgium, Denmark, Norway, and the Netherlands, the forced labor system expanded with it. In Western Europe, the Nazis initially tried persuasion. Propaganda posters promised high wages, warm lodgings, and safe working conditions in Germany. But those who went discovered the truth: long hours, brutal discipline, and hostile treatment. When word spread back home, voluntary recruitment collapsed, and the Nazis turned to coercion. France introduced the notorious STO, forcing young Frenchmen to leave their families and serve in German factories. Many fled to join resistance movements, but hundreds of thousands could not escape the system. The turning point came in 1941, when Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history against the Soviet Union. Millions of Soviet prisoners of war were captured, and the Nazis viewed them as expendable. They were starved, beaten, and forced into labor with almost no expectation of survival. Soviet civilians were also seized in massive numbers, entire towns were emptied, and German forces organized raids known as Lepankas, where anyone unlucky enough to be on the street could be dragged away. The Eastern Territories became hunting grounds for human labor. By 1942, Germany's economy depended on forced labor. With so many German men fighting at the front lines, factories lacked workers and farms lacked hands to harvest crops. The solution: cold, calculated, and efficient was to increase the flow of enslaved workers from occupied regions. Every conquered nation became a human reservoir. The deportations became more systematic, with quotas, schedules, and specialized units operating the capture and shipment of civilians. Forced labor was no longer improvised, it had become a bureaucratic machine. German corporations played a major role. Companies like IG Farben, Krupp, Siemens, BMW, and Volkswagen requested workers from the Nazi administration. They demanded more laborers as production needs grew, and the Nazi state delivered. Camps were built near factories, barracks were erected beside mines. Prisoners and civilians worked side by side under guard towers and barbed wire. Businesses saved money by avoiding wages, and the regime gained weapons, machinery, and goods to fuel the front lines. It was a ruthless partnership, driven by profit on one side and ideology on the other. Inside Germany, posters and radio broadcasts continued emphasizing the need for workers, masking the reality of the suffering behind factory walls. Entire cities depended on forced labor. Farms relied on Polish teenagers. Chemical plants ran on Soviet prisoners. Military installations were built by French, Dutch, Belgian, Yugoslav, and Greek civilians. In some regions, 1 out of every 3 workers was a foreign slave. What made the system even more horrifying was its ideological escalation. For Jews, Roma, and political prisoners, labor was not merely exploitation, it was extermination. The phrase extermination through labor became a policy at camps like Auschwitz. People were expected to die from starvation, disease, beatings, exhaustion, or execution. Work was a weapon used to erase entire communities. While industrial forced laborers in Germany struggled to survive, those in concentration camps were deliberately worked to death. By late 1942, the system was unstoppable. It had grown into a continent-wide network controlled by Nazi administrators, military officers, SS units, transport authorities, and corporate managers. Millions were trapped inside it, uprooted from their families, stripped of rights, and forced into conditions that tested the limits of human endurance. Germany had built an empire not only of land but of labor, an empire powered by the blood and sweat of people who never chose to serve it. The rise of Nazi forced labor was not an accident of war. It was the product of ideology, ambition, and the cold logic of a nation determined to dominate Europe at any cost. It was a story written in train timetables, factory quotas, and the terrified whispers of families waiting for footsteps at their door. Life inside the forced labor camps. They arrived in the dead of night, when the world was quiet enough for fear to breathe. The train doors slid open, and the cold air rushed in like a warning. People stumbled out: French teenagers, Polish farmers, Soviet prisoners, Czech mothers clutching children blinking at the harsh lights, and the silhouettes of guards waiting with rifles. Nobody knew the name of the place they had been brought to. They only knew that it felt like the end of something and the beginning of something far worse. From that first moment, the forced labor camps announced themselves not with words but with rules: you will obey, you will work, and you will survive only if luck and strength stay with you longer than they stay with the person beside you. The camps varied in shape and size, but their purpose was always the same: to control human bodies so completely that resistance became nearly impossible. Some camps sat beside factories where smoke rose day and night, others stood near mines, quarries, rail yards, or forests. A few were hidden deep in rural regions, where the silence made escape unthinkable. Barbed wire encircled them all, and the sight of watchtowers told you that every movement was being measured by a finger resting above a trigger. The guards rarely spoke, and when they did, it was to shout commands that cut through the cold like metal scraping stone. Daily life began long before sunrise. A siren or whistle tore through the darkness, and within seconds the barracks' long wooden buildings that smelled of sweat, soil, and sickness came alive with frantic shuffling. Workers dressed in whatever scraps they had been issued, thin shirts, coarse trousers, wooden clogs that blistered the feet. They stood in lines for roll call, waiting as guards counted them again and again, sometimes for hours, regardless of weather. Snow fell on bare heads, rain soaked uniforms, heat suffocated lungs, but the lines remained frozen in place. Anyone who collapsed was dragged out and beaten. Anyone who attempted to argue disappeared into a punishment cell. Food, if it could be called that, was the first hint of the day's cruelty. Breakfast was a watery coffee-like liquid or a thin soup with barely enough substance to fill a spoon. Bread rations were small, often moldy, and meant to last the entire day. People learned to hide pieces for later, even if it meant risking severe punishment. Hunger was not just a sensation here, it was a shadow that followed every step, whispering that your strength was slipping and that tomorrow might be the day your body failed. Then came the march to the work sites. In some camps it was a few hundred meters, in others it was several kilometers through mud, snow, or scorching dust. The march itself was a test of endurance. Guards struck anyone who slowed down. Those who fell behind were dragged back to camp or, in some cases, shot where they lay. Yet, as brutal as the march was, it was only the doorway into the true engine of suffering, the labor itself. Inside factories, workers stood at machines that thundered for 12 to 16 hours at a stretch. They hammered metal parts, moved heavy equipment, assembled weapons, or worked with chemicals that burned skin and lungs. Breaks were rare, and fainting from exhaustion brought not sympathy but more blows. Mines were even worse. Men crawled through narrow tunnels with barely enough air to breathe, swinging tools in darkness lit only by flickering lamps. Accidents were common. Cave-ins, gas leaks, or collapsing walls could wipe out dozens in minutes. Above ground, construction laborers built roads, bunkers, and airfields, lifting stones and pouring concrete until their arms trembled uncontrollably. The pace never slowed because the Nazi war machine demanded constant output. Germany needed weapons, vehicles, housing for soldiers, fuel, and supplies. Every bolt tightened, every railway track laid, every sack of coal hauled forward was counted as a small victory for the Reich. For the laborers, each task was a reminder of how deeply they had been trapped inside a system that measured their worth by the muscles in their arms and the hours they could endure before collapsing. Punishments shaped life in the camp as much as work did. There were beatings, isolation cells, food deprivation, and forced standing for hours under the sun or in freezing wind. For minor infractions, speaking out of turn, failing to meet a quota, losing a tool, workers could be tied to posts or ordered to perform impossible tasks. For major violations, the consequences were often fatal. The guards wielded absolute power, and cruelty became routine, almost casual. A misinterpreted glance or a moment of hesitation could decide a person's fate. Yet even in such darkness, human nature stubbornly clung to hope. People formed bonds in whispers and shared glances. Workers exchanged pieces of bread, traded secrets about which guards were the least violent, or offered strength through simple acts, supporting someone during the march, covering for another who had collapsed, or giving up a blanket on a freezing night. These small acts became lifelines. In a world where everything was designed to crush spirits, the quiet determination to help another person became an act of rebellion. The camp's underground culture developed in unexpected ways. People created improvised tools, smuggled messages, or sabotaged equipment on assembly lines by loosening bolts or misaligning parts. Even a momentary slowdown felt like reclaiming a slice of control. Songs were hummed under breath, stories were told in secret, and memories of home were shared like treasures. Some prisoners kept mental calendars, marking days by the angle of sunlight or the pattern of guard rotations. Anything that reminded them they were still human became a shield against despair. The nights, however, were the hardest. After work, meals were barely enough to quiet the stomach. Barracks echoed with coughing, groans, and whispers of those too ill to rise the next morning. Lice crawled in mattresses. The sick were often left untreated, their conditions worsening until a guard removed them, never to return. People prayed silently, as much to be spared as to remember that someone, somewhere, still loved them. Despite everything, survival instincts grew sharper. People learned which tasks to perform slowly to conserve strength and which to complete quickly to avoid punishment. They memorized guard habits, weather patterns, and the times when supervision was weakest. They learned to hide injuries, because weakness could lead to death. And through it all, they carried a fragile hope that the war might end before they did. Inside the forced labor camps, life was not lived, it was endured, measured one breath at a time, one step at a time, one heartbeat away from collapse. The camps were built to break bodies and crush spirits, but the resilience of those trapped inside created a quiet, unspoken truth that even the guards could not fully extinguish. As long as a person was still alive, even in chains, the story was not yet over. Resistance, survival, and human courage. Survival in the world of Nazi forced labor did not come from strength alone. It came from something deeper, something the guards could not measure or punish, the quiet, determined refusal to let despair win. The people trapped inside the system discovered that even the smallest act of resistance could feel like reclaiming a piece of their stolen humanity. And so, in the shadows of factories, in whispered conversations inside barracks, in the flicker of a candle smuggled under a blanket, they created a universe of resilience hidden behind the physical brutality of their daily existence. From the earliest days of deportation, resistance started long before prisoners reached the camps. Families scribbled notes on scraps of paper and pushed them through train cracks, hoping someone would find them and tell loved ones where they had been taken. Villagers left buckets of water and pieces of bread near railway tracks, knowing that prisoners inside locked wagons might stretch out their hands for even a moment of relief. These gestures were risky. Helping a forced laborer could lead to arrest or worse, yet they continued, forming an invisible network of courage that stretched across occupied Europe. Inside the camps and worksites, resistance took many shapes. Some people fought by slowing down the machines they were forced to operate. They loosened screws, misaligned gears, scraped identification numbers off parts, or allowed chemicals to mix incorrectly. A small delay here, a faulty component there, tiny acts that, when multiplied by thousands, rippled through the German industrial system. The guards rarely suspected sabotage at first, chalking up mistakes to fatigue. But as failures increased, punishments grew harsher. Yet workers continued anyway, willing to risk everything for brief flashes of defiance. There were other forms of resistance, more dangerous, more fragile, and sometimes almost invisible. Workers smuggled messages between camps, using laundry, bread sacks, or hollowed-out tools. These messages warned others about guard rotations, escape opportunities, and new deportation lists. A few managed to pass intelligence to resistance groups outside, informing them about factory layouts and supply routes. Even a single scrap of information could help a partisan group derail a train or blow up a railway bridge. Escape was a dream few dared to attempt, but for some, desperation carved the path. The most successful escapes happened in rural camps where forests provided cover. Prisoners memorized guard habits for months, waited for foggy nights, and planned routes that avoided villages full of informers. Those who escaped did not always find freedom, they often found shelter in partisan units, using their knowledge of the camps to help others flee. Their stories traveled back to the barracks, whispered like myths that kept hope alive. Even those who had no intention of escaping listened, imagining themselves running through trees, breathing air that wasn't watched by rifles. For many prisoners, resistance did not involve sabotage or escape, it was simply the act of staying alive another day. Hunger, disease, exhaustion, and punishment were constant companions. To push through these conditions required mental strength as fierce as any weapon. People created small rituals, a morning prayer, a folded photograph under a thin mattress, a piece of bread saved for a friend, a song hummed when guards weren't listening. These rituals became anchors in a world designed to strip away dignity. Within the barracks, friendships formed not through choice but necessity. People bonded over shared suffering, shielding each other from the worst of the guards' cruelty. Someone who collapsed on the march could feel two hands grip their arms, lifting them just enough to avoid being seen. A person too sick to eat was given a portion of someone else's bread. Prisoners traded stories of home, described meals they once ate, and spoke the names of people they longed to see again. These conversations, simple, fragile, and full of longing, became a rebellion against the dehumanization the Nazis imposed. Some acts of courage were quiet, but others were extraordinary. Jewish laborers, who faced the worst treatment, often took the greatest risks, knowing their chances of survival were already slim. They smuggled children into safer zones, forged papers, and hid sick workers scheduled for execution. Soviet prisoners defied orders even under threat of immediate death, refusing to salute guards or refusing to betray fellow inmates. French and Belgian workers managed to organize small strikes inside workshops, delaying production and forcing guards to reassess their routines. Women carried their own forms of resistance, often unnoticed but deeply impactful. They shared sewing needles, repaired clothes in secret, stole medicine from factory storerooms, and nursed the weakest prisoners with whatever they had. They memorized news from overheard radio broadcasts and repeated it from barrack to barrack, giving others something priceless, the knowledge that the outside world had not forgotten them, that armies were moving, that liberation might come. News, real or imagined, was the camp's lifeline. Rumors circulated constantly, whispers of Allied landings, Soviet advances, German retreats. Workers clung to these stories even when they knew they might be false. Hope, in this place, was as necessary as food. It kept people moving when their bodies wanted to collapse. It preserved the will to endure when everything else seemed broken. Yet courage did not always come in dramatic gestures. Sometimes it came from refusing to give the guards the satisfaction of seeing fear. Some prisoners maintained a straight posture no matter how tired they felt. Others spoke politely but firmly when insulted, a small reminder that their dignity had not been erased. A few learned to control their expressions so completely that the guards could not read their emotions. In a world where they controlled nothing, controlling their own faces felt like a victory. The path of resistance was full of danger. Informers lurked everywhere, prisoners who traded information for better treatment or extra bread. A single careless word could lead to punishment, or worse, to the execution of several innocent people. Still, the spirit of defiance survived because it grew out of something the Nazis could not extinguish, the human belief that life was worth fighting for, even in its most battered form. Late in the war, as Germany began losing ground, the atmosphere inside the camps changed. Guards grew more unpredictable, sometimes more violent, sometimes strangely hesitant. Prisoners sensed the shift and took bolder steps, breaking tools openly, sharing forbidden items, planning escapes in groups rather than alone. Rumors of liberation became stronger, echoing through the barracks with every passing week. Through every grim day, every brutal march, every night filled with coughing and cold, one truth endured: the prisoners were not simply victims. They were survivors who fought in ways that history often overlooks. They resisted with their minds, their hands, their friendships, and their refusal to disappear quietly. Their courage lived in both the smallest gestures and the most daring acts, turning even the darkest corners of the camps into places where humanity still flickered, shaken, but not broken. The collapse of the system and the legacy after the war. By the beginning of 1944, something strange began to ripple through the forced labor world, something prisoners sensed long before they saw it. Guards who once barked orders with confidence now whispered among themselves. Trains that had always arrived on strict schedules came late, sometimes half empty, sometimes not at all. Rumors floated through the barracks like drifting smoke: the front lines were moving, German cities were burning under Allied bombs, and the war that had swallowed millions of lives was starting to crack under its own weight. But inside the camps, where each day felt like a lifetime, nobody dared to believe too quickly. Freedom, after all, was something they had learned not to imagine. The signs became more obvious when the nights grew louder. In distant towns, the deep rumble of explosions echoed like thunder. Workers in factories noticed that the air raid sirens screamed longer each week. Entire shifts were interrupted as guards herded them into shelters, where they huddled in darkness, listening to the sky tear itself apart. Some prisoners prayed silently for the bombs to hit closer, not to kill them, but to shatter the system that kept them enslaved. Others feared the chaos, uncertain whether liberation or death would arrive first. As Germany's war machine crumbled, the forced labor system began to collapse with it. Supplies dwindled. Food rations, already painfully small, shrank further. Guards grew frustrated and unpredictable. Some took out their anger on prisoners with sudden beatings, others avoided confrontation altogether, as if sensing that their authority was slipping. The once rigid routines of the camps began to unravel. Quotas dropped because factories could not get the materials they needed. Some workshops shut down entirely, leaving workers in eerie silence, unsure what would happen next. In some camps, German supervisors disappeared overnight, leaving their posts without explanation. Prisoners woke to find workshops locked, barracks unguarded, or watchtowers manned by only a single distracted soldier. Whispers spread rapidly: the front was too close, the guards were afraid, and the world outside was shifting faster than anyone could control. Yet even as the system weakened, the danger increased. The Nazis, desperate to erase evidence of their crimes, began moving prisoners deeper into Germany. Long marches, later known as death marches, dragged exhausted workers across frozen fields and bombed out villages. Anyone who stumbled was left behind, the crack of a rifle following a few seconds later. Those who stayed in the camps lived in a strange limbo. Bombs fell more frequently. Fires raged beyond the camp walls. Smoke rolled across the sky and settled on rooftops like a heavy blanket. But the gates remained locked. Liberation felt close enough to taste, yet impossibly far. Time stretched and twisted as prisoners waited for something, anything, to break the stalemate. Many were too weak to stand, disease spread in cramped barracks, hunger sharpened into a pain that pulsed through the bones. But amid this suffering, the sense of approaching change grew stronger every day. Then, suddenly, it happened. In camp after camp, liberation arrived not through grand announcements but through moments that felt unreal. A guard vanished. A siren failed to sound. The gate swung open without command. In some places, Allied tanks rolled through the entrance, and soldiers stared in shock at the thin, hollow-eyed figures who approached hesitantly, unsure whether they were dreaming. In others, prisoners pushed down the gates themselves, realizing that no one was left to stop them. The war had devoured the very men who once controlled their lives. Liberation was not a single moment of joy but a complicated mixture of relief, disbelief, and grief. Many were too weak to celebrate. Some collapsed into the arms of soldiers, sobbing without sound. Others wandered the camp in a daze, touching walls, tools, bunks, objects that had defined their imprisonment, trying to understand that the nightmare had finally broken. There were reunions that felt miraculous and silences that felt unbearable. For every person who stepped into the sunlight, there were countless others who had not survived to see it. As the camps emptied, the world learned the scale of what had happened. Allied investigators walked through sites littered with abandoned boots, rotting food, and half-burned documents. They uncovered ledgers listing thousands of workers like inventory items, barracks built for hundreds that housed thousands, and fields where shallow graves marked the final resting place of the neglected and unnamed. Factories revealed workshops filled with unfinished weapons, machines coated in dust, and tools left mid-task as guards fled. The collapse of the forced labor system exposed not just brutality but the vast industrial network that had relied on it. For the survivors, the journey after liberation was often harder than anyone expected. Many had no homes to return to, cities were bombed, borders redrawn, families scattered or murdered. Some were sent to displaced persons camps, unsure where they belonged in a world that had changed while they were trapped behind fences. They searched for relatives, followed rumors across borders, and clung to lists posted on walls, hoping to find a familiar name. Every discovery was either a miracle or a heartbreak. Justice, too, unfolded slowly. After the war, trials began to hold Nazi officials and camp overseers accountable. Some faced international courts, others escaped into new lives and disappeared for years. German companies that had profited from slave labor were exposed, their leaders forced to testify about contracts, quotas, and payments. The evidence was overwhelming: documents, testimonies, photographs, but the process of proving guilt was painful and complicated. Survivors stood before judges, recounting stories they had hoped never to relive. Their words, though difficult, became the backbone of the historical record. The legacy of forced labor stretched far beyond the courtrooms. Entire nations carried the scars. Poland mourned generations lost. The Soviet Union honored millions who had vanished into camps. France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Greece, Yugoslavia, and others remembered young men and women who never returned. Schools, memorials, and museums were created to preserve the history because forgetting, many believed, was the first step toward repeating. Yet the deepest legacy lived within the survivors themselves. Their bodies healed unevenly, their minds carried memories that time could not fully erase. But they rebuilt, found work, started families, and shaped new lives from the ruins of their stolen years. Some wrote books, others stayed silent, but all carried the weight of knowing that the world they emerged into had been forever changed by the brutality they had endured. The collapse of the Nazi forced labor system marked the end of a machinery built on cruelty, exploitation, and dehumanization. But it also marked the beginning of an enduring truth, that history, no matter how dark, must be remembered to ensure it never returns. The survivors became living reminders, fragile, resilient, and essential, of what humanity can endure, and what it must never allow again.